Hello everyone, welcome to the Sleeping Times channel. Tonight, we bring you an extraordinary journey that will transport you directly to the dark streets of medieval Europe, where you will discover the most desperate and creative strategies humanity ever invented to survive the end of the world. Imagine waking up on an October morning in 1347, when the smell of burning herbs mixes with the aroma of vinegar in the streets, when the sound of bells constantly echoes through the cities, and when every breath could be the difference between life and death. This is not fiction. This is the reality of Europe during the Black Death, when a third of the population disappeared and the survivors had to completely reinvent their ways of living. In the coming hours, we will walk through medieval alleys enveloped in aromatic smoke, feel the leather of the plague doctors' beaked masks, touch the sacred amulets people carried as a last hope, and witness the extraordinary creativity that emerges when we face the impossible. Come with me on this fascinating journey through miraculous recipes, protective rituals, improvised quarantines, and survival strategies that reveal the best and the most desperate of human nature. This is the story of how our ancestors faced the medieval apocalypse, a celebration of human resilience, of creativity born from despair, and of the transformative power of hope that persists even in the darkest hours of history. If you enjoy stories that relax, educate, and make you reflect on the extraordinary strength of the human spirit, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss anything. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. And remember, every week we bring new historical journeys and unique moments waiting to lull your dreams. Are you ready for this trip into the Black Death survival strategies? Then, make yourself comfortable, relax, and prepare to discover how humanity found light in history's deepest darkness. When the first news of the plague reached European cities in 1347, fear spread faster than the disease itself. People firmly believed that the air was poisoned, corrupted by malignant vapors emanating from the earth or descending from the heavens as divine punishment. This belief in the miasma theory led to the first and most desperate attempts to purify the environment, strategies that we now know were completely ineffective against a disease transmitted by fleas. The medieval streets filled with dense aromatic smoke. On every corner, bonfires crackled constantly, fueled by fragrant woods, dried herbs, and precious spices. Rosemary, considered sacred, burned alongside thyme and lavender, creating thick clouds that enveloped entire cities in an artificial mist. The constant sound of fire consuming dry wood mingled with the murmurs of prayers, as people believed they were literally burning the evil from the air. Inside homes, small bronze and iron braziers were kept lit day and night. Families burned incense imported from the East, aromatic resins that cost fortunes but were considered investments in survival. The sweet, penetrating scent of frankincense mixed with the earthier aroma of myrrh, creating a dense and almost suffocating atmosphere in the closed rooms. Windows remained sealed, as it was believed that any entry of outside air could bring death. Doctors of the time developed elaborate masks, true works of art born of fear. Made of cured leather and shaped like bird beaks, these masks were filled with a carefully prepared mixture of dried herbs, rose petals, cloves, and other aromatic substances. The leather, treated with special oils, molded perfectly to the face, creating a barrier believed to filter out the pestilential vapors. The muffled sound of breathing through these masks became a sinister soundtrack in the deserted streets. People carried small aromatic amulets, sachets of fine fabric stuffed with ground spices. These perfumed talismans were constantly pressed against the nose, especially when passing through places considered dangerous like markets, churches, or cemeteries. The soft touch of silk or linen against the skin became an automatic gesture, a ritual of protection that offered more psychological comfort than real effectiveness. The aroma of cinnamon, nutmeg, and ginger accompanied every movement, creating a personal olfactory bubble. Vinegar became the most precious liquid of the era, used to wash everything that might have been contaminated. Cloths soaked in vinegar were used to seal window and door cracks, creating a liquid barrier against the supposed deadly vapors. The acidic, penetrating smell of vinegar permeated clothes, hair, and skin, becoming the characteristic scent of those trying to survive. Hands were obsessively washed with this solution until the skin became red and dry from the acid. Rosewater and other floral distillates were constantly sprayed into the air in an attempt to neutralize the invisible miasmas. Women walked through houses with small silver sprayers, spreading perfumed droplets that momentarily sparkled in the candlelight before dissipating into the stale air. The soft sound of the liquid being sprayed mixed with the delicate tinkling of glass vials, creating a domestic symphony of desperate hope. Municipal authorities ordered the burning of garbage and waste in public squares, believing that eliminating unpleasant odors would purify the environment. Huge bonfires consumed mountains of debris, creating columns of black smoke that rose like dark towers over the cities. The intense heat of these fires warmed the surrounding air, creating thermal currents that made the smoke dance in hypnotic spirals, while people watched with a mixture of hope and terror. Gardens of medicinal herbs were urgently planted in every available space. Backyards, squares, and even rooftops were transformed into small aromatic gardens, where basil, mint, sage, and dozens of other plants considered purifying grew. The vibrant green of these plants contrasted with the dark atmosphere of the cities, offering not only hope for healing, but also a visual beauty that calmed tormented spirits. The soft sound of the wind rustling the leaves created a natural melody of tranquility. Despite all these elaborate and costly efforts, the plague continued its relentless march across Europe. The air purification strategies, though ineffective against the true cause of the disease, revealed human creativity in the face of the unknown and the power of hope in times of absolute despair. These early attempts to combat the plague established patterns of behavior that would influence medical practices for centuries, showing how fear can both inspire and blind humanity in its quest for survival. In medieval kitchens, transformed into improvised laboratories, the strangest combinations of ingredients simmered. Folk medicine flourished during the plague like never before, mixing superstition, ancestral herbal knowledge, and pure despair. Each family jealously guarded their secret recipes, passed down through generations or invented in the urgency of the moment. The sound of pestles grinding dried herbs echoed through homes, while cauldrons bubbled with mixtures that exuded exotic and often nauseating aromas. Theriac, considered the universal panacea, became the most sought-after remedy of the era. This complex mixture contained over 60 different ingredients, including dried and ground vipers, which were considered the most powerful component. The preparation process took months, with each ingredient being added during specific lunar phases. The resulting liquid had a dark amber color and a bitter taste that burned the throat, but it was consumed religiously by those who could afford its exorbitant price. Unicorn blood, actually ground narwhal horn, was sold by clever merchants as the ultimate antidote. The whitish powder was mixed with red wine, creating a pinkish potion that cost more than an entire house. People drank this mixture with almost religious reverence, believing that the mythical purity of the unicorn could neutralize any poison. The metallic taste of the powder mingled with the full-bodied flavor of the wine, creating a sensory experience that reinforced belief in its magical power. Ground pearls were dissolved in vinegar and consumed as a protective elixir. The belief was that the purity of pearls, born from the depths of the sea, could purify contaminated blood. The process of grinding pearls was laborious, performed with marble pestles to preserve their essence. The resulting liquid had a pearly sheen and an acidic taste that made eyes water, but it was considered a small price to pay for life. Potable gold, a solution of gold particles in alcohol, was reserved only for the wealthiest. It was believed that the noble metal could transmit its incorruptibility to the human body, making it immune to disease. The golden liquid shimmered in candlelight as if it contained its own light, and its metallic taste was masked with honey and spices. The delicate clinking of coins being scraped to create the gold dust became a familiar sound in noble households. Bezoars, stones found in the stomach of wild goats, were considered detectors and neutralizers of poisons. These smooth, dark stones were dipped into drinks before consumption, believed to change color in the presence of toxic substances. The cold touch of the stone against the lips became a comforting ritual, a final check before consuming any food or drink. Many families owned only one of these precious stones, passed down from generation to generation as a family treasure. Mixtures of local herbs created potions with surprising colors and textures. Mugwort, wormwood, and absinthe were boiled together, creating a dark green liquid with mild hallucinogenic properties. The extreme bitterness of these plants was considered a sign of their medicinal potency. People drank these potions with grimaces of disgust, but persevered in the belief that the more bitter, the more effective the remedy would be. The steam rising from these concoctions had a penetrating aroma that permeated the entire house. Edible amulets were prepared with exotic ingredients imported from the East. Saffron, cardamom, and other rare spices were molded into small lozenges with honey and beeswax. These lozenges were consumed one per day, slowly dissolving in the mouth to release their complex and aromatic flavors. The waxy texture mixed with the spicy and sweet flavors, creating a sensory experience that lasted for hours. The intense gold of the saffron colored the saliva, constantly reminding them of the protection they believed they were receiving. Bloodletting was performed during specific lunar phases, with the collected blood being mixed with wine and spices before being partially reintroduced into the body. This bizarre practice was based on the belief that purified blood could combat internal infection. The dark red liquid was heated in small copper pans, exuding a metallic and sweet aroma that nauseated even the most experienced practitioners. The ritual was accompanied by prayers and chants, transforming the medical procedure into a religious ceremony. All these miraculous recipes, however elaborate and costly, consistently failed to stop the plague. Nevertheless, they represented humanity's refusal to passively accept its fate, showing a desperate creativity that blended primitive science, magic, and faith. These practices, though ineffective, offered something perhaps even more important than a cure: hope and the feeling that something, anything, was being done to combat the invisible enemy that was devastating the known world. When medicine failed and potions proved useless, people turned to the realm of the spiritual and the mystical. Protection rituals flourished throughout Europe, mixing Christian traditions with ancient pagan practices that had survived in the shadows of medieval society. In churches, the sound of bells rang incessantly, believed that the sacred vibrations could ward off the demons of the plague. The bronze of the bells warmed under the sun, and their metallic chime echoed through the cities like a sonic shield against invisible evil. Religious processions snaked through the narrow streets, carrying sacred relics and images of patron saints. Participants walked barefoot over the cold stones, their feet bleeding as an offering of voluntary suffering. The smell of incense mingled with the aroma of fresh flowers scattered along the path, creating a perfume trail believed to purify the air wherever it passed. Thick beeswax candles dripped onto the hands of the faithful, the pain of the hot wax accepted as a small sacrifice for divine protection. Circles of salt were drawn around houses, creating invisible barriers against evil forces. Coarse salt, blessed by local priests, was carefully spread in continuous lines, without breaks that could allow evil to enter. The sound of salt grains being poured onto the stone created a constant, almost hypnotic whisper. Entire families participated in this ritual, each member contributing a section of the protective circle, uniting in a ceremony that strengthened both protection and family bonds. Amulets were sewn into clothes with blessed threads, creating an invisible spiritual armor. Small leather pouches contained saints' teeth, fragments of sacred bones, or earth from the Holy Sepulchre, brought by pilgrims who had survived the dangerous journey to the Holy Land. The soft leather of the amulets warmed against the skin, becoming an intimate part of the person carrying it. The constant touch of these sacred objects offered psychological comfort, a tangible connection to the divine in times of absolute despair. Prayers were written on parchments and burned at dawn, believed that the smoke would carry the pleas directly to the heavens. The ink made with lamb's blood gave the words a reddish-brown colour that darkened further when exposed to fire. The parchment crackled and writhed in the flames, releasing a sweet, earthy aroma. The resulting ashes were carefully collected and mixed with holy water, creating a paste that was applied to the forehead as a mark of divine protection. Herbs were harvested at specific times, following ancient lunar calendars that determined when each plant was at its peak of protective power. Verbena, collected at midnight on a full moon, was considered especially potent against evil spirits. The morning dew still glistened on the leaves when they were picked, and it was believed that this celestial moisture concentrated divine protection. The herbs were dried in bundles hung from ceilings, filling homes with earthy and comforting aromas. Holy water was sprinkled in every room of the houses daily, creating a morning ritual that marked the beginning of each day of survival. Small silver aspersers were used to distribute the sacred droplets, which momentarily sparkled in the air before landing on furniture and people. The soft sound of water being sprayed mingled with murmured prayers, creating a domestic symphony of faith and hope. The humidity left a fresh, clean scent that contrasted with the heavy odors of medicinal potions. St. John's bonfires were lit even outside the traditional season, with people jumping over the flames to spiritually purify themselves. Oak wood, considered sacred, crackled and popped, releasing golden sparks that rose like stars towards the night sky. The intense heat of the fire warmed the faces of the participants, while the smoke permeated their clothes with the aroma of burning wood. It was believed that crossing the fire symbolically burned away any spiritual contamination that could attract the plague. Collective fasts were organized by communities, with entire families abstaining from food for days on end. Hunger was offered as a sacrifice, a way to show humility before God and earn His protection. The empty stomach created a feeling of lightness that was interpreted as spiritual purification. Pure water was the only sustenance allowed, and its neutral taste became precious after hours of deprivation. The sound of stomachs rumbling in unison during communal prayers created a soundtrack of collective devotion. These protection rituals, though offering no real defense against the bubonic plague, fulfilled crucial psychological and social functions. They united communities in common purpose, offered a sense of control over the uncontrollable, and kept hope alive when reason suggested despair. The mixture of Christian and pagan traditions revealed the flexibility of human faith in the face of extreme adversity, showing how people adapted their beliefs to confront unprecedented threats. These rituals became, in themselves, a form of cultural resistance against the complete dissolution of medieval society. When cities became open-air cemeteries, those who had the means turned their eyes to the countryside, believing that distance from urban centres could offer salvation. This strategy of escape, though not based on scientific knowledge about disease transmission, ended up being one of the most effective of the time, simply by reducing human contact. The roads leading out of the cities filled with carts loaded with precious belongings, entire families abandoning their urban lives in search of refuge on rural properties. Castles and rural mansions transformed into fortresses against the plague, with their owners sealing gates and establishing strict quarantines. The stone walls, originally built for military defense, gained new purpose as sanitary barriers. Armed guards patrolled the perimeters, no longer against invading armies, but against travelers who might carry the disease. The sound of horse hooves on the courtyard stones became rare, broken only by the occasional arrival of messengers shouting their news from atop the walls, keeping a safe distance. Within these isolated properties, life took on a different rhythm, slower and more contemplative. Gardens were cultivated not only for beauty, but as a source of food and medicine, ensuring complete self-sufficiency. The aroma of fresh herbs mingled with the smell of damp earth after rain, creating an atmosphere of peace that contrasted sharply with urban chaos. Natural springs provided pure water, and their constant murmur became the soundtrack of forced tranquility, replacing the noise of city crowds. Private libraries gained renewed importance, becoming intellectual refuges where time was filled with reading and contemplation. The smell of ancient parchment and ink mingled with the aroma of beeswax candles, creating an atmosphere of erudition that calmed tormented minds. The soft sound of pages being turned echoed through the silent halls, occasionally punctuated by the scratching of quills on paper when someone took notes or wrote letters to distant relatives. These libraries became time capsules, preserving knowledge while the outside world crumbled. Private chapels saw intensive use, with prayers being offered several times a day for divine protection. Incense burned constantly, creating aromatic clouds believed to purify not only the air but also the souls of the refugees. Stained glass windows filtered sunlight, creating kaleidoscopic patterns on the stone floor that changed throughout the day. The echo of murmured prayers in the stone vaults created a reverberation that amplified the sense of connection with the divine, offering spiritual comfort in times of absolute uncertainty. Long-distance communication systems were developed to maintain contact with the outside world without direct exposure. Smoke signals, mirrors reflecting sunlight, and even carrier pigeons were used to transmit messages. Watchtowers were built at the highest points of the properties, offering panoramic views that allowed the detection of approaching strangers from miles away. The wind carried the sound of distant bells, sonic codes that communicated basic information about the situation in nearby cities. Food self-sufficiency became an obsession, with gardens being expanded and animals being raised within the protective walls. Orchards provided fresh fruit, and the sweet aroma of ripe apples and pears contrasted with the bitter memories of the plague-ridden city. Barns were built to store enough grain for years of isolation, and the sound of wheat being poured into large wooden containers echoed like music of security. Private windmills ground grain, their sails slowly turning against the blue country sky, symbols of independence and survival. Simple entertainments gained new meaning, with music, games, and storytelling filling the long nights of isolation. Musical instruments were played in the halls, and the soft melodies echoed through the ancient stones, creating an atmosphere of artificial normalcy. Board games were played by candlelight, with ivory and wooden pieces moved across polished surfaces that reflected the dancing flames. These activities not only passed the time, but maintained the mental sanity of the refugees, offering moments of joy amidst constant fear. Quarantine systems were established even within the properties, with different areas designated for different levels of potential exposure. Servants who needed to go out for supplies were isolated in separate buildings for determined periods before returning to the main house. Clothes were changed and burned after any external contact, and baths with boiling water and purifying herbs became mandatory rituals. The steam from these baths rose in aromatic clouds, carrying away not only physical dirt, but also the psychological fears of contamination. This strategy of fleeing to the countryside, although privileged and available only to the wealthy, proved to be one of the most effective against the plague. Physical isolation, even without scientific understanding of its importance, broke the chains of disease transmission. These rural properties became islands of civilization in an ocean of chaos, preserving not only lives but also culture, knowledge, and traditions that might have been lost forever. The experience of rural isolation during the plague would influence the attitudes of the upper classes towards epidemics for centuries, establishing patterns of behavior that would persist into modern times. In the medieval mindset, the line between food and medicine was thin, and during the plague, this distinction practically disappeared. Every meal became a strategic battle against the disease, with ingredients chosen not for taste or nutrition, but for their supposed protective properties. Kitchens transformed into culinary laboratories where ancestral recipes mingled with improvised medical theories, creating a gastronomy of fear that prioritized survival over pleasure. Garlic became the most precious ingredient of the era, consumed in quantities that left people with pungent breath for days. It was believed that its strong taste and pungent aroma could ward off not only folkloric vampires, but also pestilential miasmas. Cloves of garlic were chewed raw in the morning, creating a burning sensation in the mouth that was interpreted as a sign of internal purification. The characteristic smell permeated clothes and hair, becoming the involuntary perfume of a desperate age. Garlic necklaces were worn constantly, releasing their aroma with every body movement. Vinegar transformed from a simple condiment into an elixir of life, consumed pure or mixed with water at every meal. Its acidic taste made eyes water and throats burn. But this uncomfortable sensation was seen as evidence of its purifying effectiveness. Salads were drenched in vinegar until they were almost unpalatable, and the acidic liquid was used to preserve meats and vegetables for extended periods. The penetrating aroma of vinegar dominated homes, masking other odors and creating an acidic atmosphere believed to be hostile to disease. Oriental spices, traditionally reserved for the wealthy, became life or death investments for those who could afford them. Black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were consumed in quantities that transformed simple meals into intense sensory experiences. The heat of the pepper burned the tongue and made the nose run, sensations that were interpreted as signs that the body was being purified internally. Soups were seasoned until they were almost unpalatable, with spicy steam rising from the bowls like culinary incense. Honey, considered the food of the gods, was consumed pure or mixed with bitter herbs to create medicinal tonics. Its natural sweetness contrasted with the bitterness of medicinal plants, creating complex flavors that range from heavenly to nauseating. Crystallized honey was slowly dissolved in the mouth, gradually releasing its sugars and providing moments of pleasure amidst the medicinal diet. It was believed that its origin in pure flowers made it capable of neutralizing any internal poison. Red wine was considered purified blood of the earth, consumed not for pleasure, but as liquid medicine. Herbs were macerated in wine for weeks, creating tinctures that had deep colors and complex flavors. The alcohol extracted the active principles of the plants, resulting in beverages that were simultaneously intoxicating and medicinal. The tannic taste of the wine mixed with the bitterness of the herbs, creating potions that burned the throat but warmed the heart with hope. Strategic fasts were practiced to cleanse the body of impurities that might attract the plague. Periods of food deprivation were followed by specific meals, creating purification cycles believed to strengthen the organism. During fasts, only pure water and herbal teas were allowed, and hunger was accepted as a necessary sacrifice. The empty stomach created sensations of lightness that were interpreted as signs of spiritual and physical purification. Meats were avoided or consumed only after elaborate preparations that included long marinades in vinegar and spices. It was believed that meat could carry corruption, so its preparation became a complex ritual of culinary purification. Coarse salt was rubbed into the meat until it turned completely white, then washed repeatedly before cooking. The salting process created different textures and intense flavors that transformed familiar dishes into strange gastronomic experiences. Vegetables were classified according to medical theories that determined which were hot or cold, with diets being balanced to maintain bodily equilibrium. Roots like ginger and radish were considered especially purifying, consumed raw to maximize their effect. The pungent taste of these roots made eyes water and noses burn, sensations that were celebrated as signs of internal cleansing. Vegetable soups were prepared with specific combinations that followed ancient medicinal formulas. These survival diets, although based on incorrect medical theories, revealed the human determination to use all available resources in the fight against death. The transformation of food into medicine showed how extreme situations can completely alter basic cultural behaviors. Although ineffective against the bubonic plague, these dietary practices offered a sense of control and purpose, crucial psychological elements for maintaining hope and the will to live. The gastronomy of the plague would influence culinary traditions for generations, leaving permanent marks on European food culture that would persist long after the end of the epidemic. When the plague reached a community, entire families locked themselves in their homes, creating voluntary prisons that became both refuge and tomb. The concept of quarantine, though primitive at the time, was based on the empirical observation that isolation could offer protection. Doors were sealed with wooden planks nailed from the inside, leaving only small openings for communication with the outside world. The sound of hammers echoed through the streets as families prepared for weeks or months of total confinement. Windows were covered with thick cloths soaked in vinegar, creating barriers believed to filter contaminated air. These constantly moistened fabrics dripped vinegar down the walls, creating acidic stains that slowly corroded the wood and stone. The penetrating smell completely dominated the internal environment, mixing with body odors and creating a suffocating atmosphere that tested the limits of human endurance. The light filtered through the cloths created a constant gloom that transformed day into perpetual twilight. Improvised communication systems were established with neighbors and relatives, using ropes, baskets, and sound signals to maintain contact without physical exposure. Small baskets were lowered from upper windows to receive food and medicine left by people brave enough to venture through the streets. The creaking of ropes against the window stones became a familiar soundtrack, punctuating the deadly silence of the cities with signs of persistent life. Codes of knocks on walls allowed basic communication between adjacent houses. Food supplies were rationed with mathematical precision, with each family member receiving calculated portions to last as long as possible. Grains were counted grain by grain, and water was measured in small cups that were obsessively washed and reused. The sound of cereals being poured into small bowls marked the scarce meals, while stomachs constantly rumbled, reminding everyone of the precariousness of their situation. Homemade preserves, prepared before the quarantine, became precious treasures stored in dark, damp cellars. Personal hygiene became a complex ritual performed with limited resources, using water heated in small quantities and homemade soaps made with ashes and animal fat. Baths were taken in wooden basins, with the same water being reused by the entire family in hierarchical order. Hot steam rose from the basins, carrying aromas of medicinal herbs added to the water in the hope of additional purification. Clothes were rarely washed, only shaken and exposed to the air from the sealed windows. Limited entertainment included simple games, storytelling, and collective prayers that helped pass the time and maintain mental sanity. Playing cards made at home with parchment scraps were played by candlelight, with symbolic bets using grains or small personal items. Ancient stories were retold night after night, gaining new details with each repetition, while voices echoed through the stone walls. Songs were hummed softly so as not to attract external attention, creating intimate soundtracks of cultural resistance. Improvised medical care was performed with household resources, using stored dried herbs and traditional knowledge passed down orally. Small fires were lit in indoor braziers to prepare medicinal teas, filling homes with aromatic smoke that mingled with the stale air. Bloodletting was performed with kitchen knives sterilized in the fire, and the collected blood was obsessively examined for signs of contamination. Wounds were treated with honey and herbs, creating poultices that exuded sweet and earthy aromas. Waste management became a critical problem, with families creating internal sanitation systems using buckets and containers that were emptied through special openings in the walls. The smell of these accumulated wastes mingled with the other odors of the quarantine, creating a nauseating atmosphere that constantly tested the determination to remain isolated. Ashes from the fires were used to cover the wastes, partially reducing odors and creating stratified layers that marked the passage of time. Death within quarantine created terrible dilemmas, with bodies needing to be removed without breaking isolation. Pulley systems were improvised to lower the dead through windows, where they were collected by specialized teams wearing elaborate protective clothing. The sound of bodies being dragged through the stone streets echoed as a constant reminder of mortality, while survivors watched through cracks in the sealed windows. Prayers were murmured for the dead, creating ghostly choruses that echoed through the empty houses. These improvised quarantines, though primitive and often ineffective due to a lack of knowledge about disease transmission, represented one of the most advanced strategies of the time. They demonstrated an intuitive understanding of the importance of isolation, even without a solid scientific basis. The psychological suffering of confinement was immense, but those who managed to maintain the discipline of isolation had significantly higher chances of survival. These experiences of domestic quarantine would set precedents for public health practices that would evolve over the centuries, showing how despair can generate innovations that transcend their original time. When all other strategies failed, people turned to physical objects that could offer protection against invisible forces. The belief in the power of amulets and talismans flourished during the plague like never before, transforming jewelry, stones, and common objects into spiritual shields against death. Clandestine markets for magical objects thrived, with clever merchants selling everything from fake relics to colored stones as universal panaceas. The clinking of coins changing hands mingled with the murmur of prayers as desperate people invested their last savings in tangible hope. Iron rings were forged into specific shapes, believed that the cold metal could absorb and neutralize evil influences. Blacksmiths worked day and night, their forges glowing like earthly stars, as hammers rhythmically struck heated metal. Iron was considered especially potent when forged during eclipses or on new moon nights, times when it was believed the metal absorbed special cosmic powers. The weight of these rings on the fingers offered a constant reminder of the protection one carried, and many people wore several simultaneously, creating a metallic symphony with every hand movement. Precious stones were classified according to their colors and supposed properties, with each gem offering specific protection against different aspects of the plague. Red rubies were considered protectors of the blood, while blue sapphires protected breathing, and green emeralds purified the liver. These stones were set in pendants that were worn close to the heart, believed that their proximity to the vital organ maximized their effectiveness. Candlelight made the gems shine with intense colors, creating small rainbows that danced on the dark walls and offered visual beauty in dark times. Teeth of wild animals, especially wolves and bears, were transformed into protective necklaces believed to transfer the strength and resistance of these animals to the wearer. The yellowish ivory of the teeth contrasted with dark leather cords, creating primitive ornaments that connected their users with ancient natural forces. The rough touch of the teeth against the skin of the neck offered a constant tactile reminder of animal protection, while their wild scent mingled with human perfumes, creating unique aromas that identified each wearer. Fragments of meteorites, when available, were considered the most powerful amulets, as they came directly from the heavens and carried concentrated divine power. These dark, rough stones were polished until they shone like black mirrors, reflecting candlelight in hypnotic patterns. Their surprising weight for their small size was interpreted as evidence of spiritual density, and the cold metal slowly warmed against the skin, creating a sensation of energy being transferred from the cosmos to the human body. Ancient coins, especially those with effigies of emperors considered saints or powerful, were perforated and used as protective pendants. The bronze and silver of these coins developed a greenish-blue patina over time, colors that were interpreted as signs that the metal was absorbing evil influences from the environment. The familiar weight of the coins offered psychological comfort, connecting their wearers with times of greater stability and power. Latin inscriptions were recited as mantras, even when their meanings were unknown. Bones of saints, or fragments believed to be such, were kept in elaborate reliquaries made of gold and silver, decorated with gems and intricate engravings. These reliquaries were miniature works of art, created by artisans who invested all their talent in objects intended to save lives. The shine of the polished metal reflected candlelight, creating golden halos around the wearers. The weight of these reliquaries against the chest offered a sense of direct divine protection, a physical connection to the sacred that transcended purely spiritual faith. Dried herbs were sewn into small silk sachets that were worn close to the heart or tied to the wrists. Lavender, rosemary, and other aromatic plants gradually released their perfumes, creating personal olfactory bubbles believed to repel evil influences. The soft texture of the silk contrasted with the roughness of the dried herbs, creating complex tactile sensations that constantly reminded one of the protection being carried. These sachets were renewed regularly, with old herbs being burned in purification rituals. Religious symbols were engraved on various metals and used in specific combinations believed to amplify their protective power. Crosses, stars of David, and ancient pagan symbols were mixed without concern for religious orthodoxy, creating desperate syncretisms that reflected the urgency of the situation. The metal heated by engraving remained slightly warmer than body temperature, creating a sensation of active energy. These symbols were touched obsessively during moments of fear, polishing them until they shone like mirrors. The proliferation of amulets and talismans during the plague revealed the fundamental human need to have tangible control over invisible and incomprehensible forces. Although ineffective against the actual disease, these objects offered significant psychological benefits, reducing anxiety and providing a sense of active protection. The amulet industry that flourished during the plague established commercial and artistic traditions that would persist for centuries, influencing jewelry, religious art, and spiritual practices. These objects became physical symbols of human resistance against the unknown, tangible reminders that even in the most desperate circumstances, people find ways to keep hope alive through connections with the sacred and the mysterious. When conventional methods failed and death approached, doctors and healers resorted to increasingly extreme and bizarre treatments. The medicine of the time, based on the theory of humours and limited knowledge of anatomy, produced cures that were often more dangerous than the disease itself. Improvised operating rooms were set up in damp basements, lit only by candles that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. The smell of blood mingled with the aroma of burning herbs, creating an atmosphere that oscillated between hospital and torture chamber. Extreme bloodletting was performed until patients fainted, based on the belief that the plague was caused by corrupted blood that needed to be completely drained. Sharp knives cut veins in arms, neck, and legs, while blood was collected in bronze basins that reflected the red light of the vital fluid. The sound of blood dripping into the metal echoed like a macabre countdown, as patients became progressively paler and weaker. Leeches imported from distant swamps were applied by the dozens to the body, creating grotesque patterns of small black creatures feeding voraciously. Trepanation, the drilling of the skull, was performed in the belief that the plague could be caused by malignant vapors trapped in the head. Primitive metal drills were heated in the fire before being applied to the bone, creating smoke and the nauseating smell of burning bone. The sound of the drill penetrating the skull was muffled by the screams of the patients, who were kept conscious throughout the procedure. Small pieces of bone were removed and obsessively examined for signs of corruption, while the exposed brain visibly pulsed through the opening. Cauterization with red-hot iron was applied to buboes and other manifestations of the disease, based on the theory that extreme heat could burn away internal corruption. Irons of different shapes were heated until red, creating patterns of burns believed to channel evil out of the body. The smell of burning flesh permeated the treatment rooms, mixing with the steam rising from the open wounds. Patients were tied to wooden tables to prevent involuntary movements, while their screams echoed through the stone vaults like choruses of suffering. Violent purges were induced with mixtures of poisonous plants that caused uncontrollable vomiting and diarrhea for days on end. It was believed that completely emptying the body of all fluids could expel the disease along with corrupted humours. Ceramic containers were placed around the beds to collect the expelled fluids, which were meticulously examined for signs of improvement. The acidic smell of vomit mingled with the foul odours of diarrhea, creating a nauseating atmosphere that tested even the most experienced doctors. Baths in human and animal urine were prescribed as a form of external purification, with patients being immersed in tubs filled with the yellowish, foul-smelling liquid. The urine was heated until warm, creating ammoniacal vapors that burned the eyes and throats of everyone present. It was believed that the natural salts and acids in the urine could dissolve the corruption that accumulated on the skin. Patients remained immersed for hours, while their skin became irritated and red from prolonged contact with the corrosive liquid. Animal organ transplants were attempted in extreme cases, with pig livers and sheep hearts being surgically implanted into human patients. These primitive operations were performed without anesthesia or knowledge of immunological rejection, invariably resulting in rapid and painful death. Animal blood mixed with human blood, creating mixtures that doctors interpreted as signs of successful fusion. Rudimentary surgical instruments were heated in the fire for basic sterilization, but the lack of knowledge about infections made these procedures fatal. Inhalation of toxic vapors was prescribed as a way to burn the disease internally, with patients being forced to breathe sulfur, mercury, and other poisonous substances. Special braziers were placed near the beds, releasing colored vapors that created toxic rainbows in the stale air of the rooms. The sulfurous smell burned the nostrils and throat, while the metallic vapors left a bitter taste in the mouth that persisted for days. Patients coughed violently, expelling blood and mucus that were interpreted as signs that the treatment was working. Application of heavy metals directly onto the skin included ointments made with lead, mercury, and arsenic, substances that were considered purifying due to their obvious toxicity. These metallic pastes were spread over the entire body, creating a shiny, toxic second skin that reflected candlelight like liquid armor. The absorption of these metals through the skin caused systemic poisoning that was mistaken for progress in treatment. Patients developed tremors and convulsions that were interpreted as signs that the body was expelling the disease. These extreme treatments, though completely ineffective and often lethal, revealed the absolute despair of medieval medicine in the face of a disease it did not understand. The willingness of doctors and patients to try anything, no matter how painful or dangerous, demonstrated both the human determination to fight death and the dangers of scientific ignorance. Many patients who might have survived the plague died due to the treatments they received, creating a tragic irony where the cure was more deadly than the disease. These extreme medical practices would leave deep scars on public trust in medicine, influencing attitudes towards medical treatment for future generations, and contributing to the development of more cautious, evidence-based approaches that would characterize modern medicine. Faced with the devastation caused by the plague, entire communities were forced to reinvent their social structures, creating collective survival systems that defied centuries of tradition. Cities that once operated based on rigid hierarchies found themselves compelled to implement emergency democratic measures, where survival outweighed social status. Crisis councils were formed by representatives from all classes, meeting in open squares where the wind could disperse any contamination. The sound of bells summoned these urgent assemblies, echoing through the empty streets as desperate calls for collective action. Long-distance communication systems were developed to coordinate efforts without direct physical contact. Signal towers were built at the highest points of the cities, using mirrors, flags, and bonfires to transmit coded messages between different neighborhoods. The gleam of mirrors reflecting sunlight created flashes that could be seen for miles, while the smoke from signal fires rose in specific patterns that communicated information about deaths, supplies, and medical needs. Drums were beaten in rhythmic sequences that echoed through the hills, creating a sonic language that transcended linguistic barriers. Organized food distribution transformed chaotic markets into militarized survival systems. Queues were organized with strict distancing, marked on the ground with white lime that created geometric patterns in the stone squares. Armed guards maintained order not with violence, but with moral authority derived from the collective need for survival. Food was mathematically rationed, with each family receiving calculated portions based on the number of members and their ages. The sound of grains being measured in wooden containers became the soundtrack of forced equity. Urban cleanup brigades were organized with volunteers who risked their lives to keep the cities habitable. Equipped with improvised protective clothing made of thick leather and fabric masks soaked in vinegar, these anonymous heroes removed bodies, cleaned streets, and kept water sources functioning. Special carts were built for transporting the dead, with fabric-lined wheels to reduce noise that might attract looters. The creaking of these carts through the stone streets became a familiar and feared sound, marking the passage of organized death. field hospitals were established in abandoned buildings, transforming palaces and monasteries into centers for collective treatment. Large halls were divided with linen curtains, creating improvised wards where dozens of patients were treated simultaneously. The echo of groans and prayers reverberated through the stone vaults, creating involuntary choruses of human suffering. Fires were kept burning constantly to purify the air, filling these spaces with aromatic smoke that mingled with medicinal and bodily odors. Collective quarantine systems were implemented in entire neighborhoods, with communities voluntarily isolating themselves to protect the rest of the city. Barricades were built at the entrances to these neighborhoods, not to prevent exit, but to clearly mark the isolation zones. Supplies were left at specific points outside the barricades, collected by volunteers who risked their lives to keep the isolated fed. The silence of these quarantined neighborhoods contrasted dramatically with the chaos of the rest of the city, creating islands of forced quiet in oceans of despair. Emergency education was organized to teach basic hygiene and prevention practices, with medical knowledge being democratized by necessity. Rudimentary posters were affixed in public places, using simple symbols that could be understood even by illiterates. Preachers and improvised teachers walked the streets, shouting instructions on hand washing, food preparation, and symptom recognition. Their voices echoed through the narrow alleys, competing with the wind to carry life-saving information. Psychological support networks emerged naturally, with communities creating informal systems of emotional support to combat collective despair. Prayer groups gathered in open spaces, maintaining physical distance but creating spiritual proximity through synchronized chants and prayers. The sound of voices united in collective supplications created sound waves that seemed to rise to the heavens, carrying the hopes of entire communities. Stories were shared from window to window, creating collective narratives of resistance and survival. Alternative economic systems were developed when money lost meaning in the face of scarcity of essential goods. Organized bartering replaced monetary transactions, with markets specializing in exchanging food for medicine, clothes for protection, and services for supplies. Lists of equivalences were maintained by honest merchants, establishing relative values that allowed for fair exchanges. The clinking of coins was replaced by the sound of objects being moved, creating a new commercial music based on real need rather than abstract value. These community strategies, born of despair but implemented with collective wisdom, demonstrated the extraordinary capacity of human societies to adapt to existential crises. Many of these social innovations would survive the plague, influencing the development of public health systems, emergency management, and community organization for centuries. The experience of social reorganization during the plague set precedents for cooperation in times of crisis that would become fundamental for the survival of future civilizations. These communities discovered that, paradoxically, the threat of collective extinction could generate more advanced and humane forms of social organization, lessons that would transcend their original time and influence the development of modern society. When the plague finally began to recede, leaving behind a transformed continent, the survival strategies that had been developed during the darkest years left permanent marks on European culture. Entire cities needed to be rebuilt, not just physically, but socially, incorporating the lessons learned during the crisis. Streets were widened to allow better air circulation, based on the persistent belief that cramped spaces favored disease. The sound of hammers and saws constantly echoed as a new Europe emerged from the ashes of the old, carrying both scars and wisdom. Medical practices were permanently altered, with doctors developing more systematic protocols based on observations made during the epidemic. Although many theories were incorrect, the method of careful observation and symptom documentation laid foundations for more scientific approaches. Medical schools began to teach not only theory, but also practice based on real experience with diseases. The smell of medicinal herbs permeated these institutions, where students learned from both successes and failures of attempts to cure during the plague. Hospital architecture evolved dramatically, incorporating principles of ventilation and isolation that had been empirically discovered during the crisis. Larger and more numerous windows became standard, allowing sunlight to enter, which was believed to have healing properties. Corridors were widened to facilitate patient movement and reduce crowding. The echo of footsteps in spacious corridors replaced the muffled sound of confined spaces, creating environments that seemed more conducive to healing. Medicinal gardens were integrated into hospital designs, providing both medicines and visual beauty for recovering patients. Public health systems were born from the organizational needs developed during the plague, with municipal authorities taking on responsibilities that were previously left to private or religious initiatives. Mortality records began to be systematically kept, creating databases that would allow for a better understanding of future epidemiological patterns. Health inspectors were appointed to monitor sanitary conditions in markets and residential neighborhoods. The sound of bells announcing sanitary regulations became part of the urban soundtrack, constantly reminding everyone of the importance of collective vigilance. Culinary traditions were permanently modified, with spices and herbs that had been used medicinally being incorporated into everyday cooking. Garlic, which had been obsessively consumed during the plague, became a basic ingredient in many regional recipes. Vinegar gained renewed importance, not only as a condiment, but as a preservative and purifier. The aroma of these medicinal spices permeated kitchens throughout Europe, creating a gastronomy that mixed pleasure and protection. Family recipes began to include ingredients that were once considered exclusively medicinal. Religious practices evolved to incorporate elements of sanitary protection, with purification rituals gaining renewed importance. Holy water was sprinkled not only for spiritual reasons, but also as a primitive hygienic measure. Incense was burned in larger quantities and more frequently, based on the belief that it purified the air. The sound of collective prayers included specific pleas for protection against diseases, creating liturgies that mixed traditional faith with practical sanitary concerns. Religious processions incorporated elements of social distancing that would persist for generations. International trade was reorganized based on quarantine protocols that had been developed during the crisis. Ports established mandatory isolation periods for ships coming from affected regions, creating lazaretto systems that would become a global standard. Goods were fumigated with aromatic herbs before distribution, a procedure that, although ineffective against the plague, set precedents for sanitary inspection. The smell of burning spices became associated with commercial safety, creating olfactory connections between aroma and trust. Social structures were permanently altered, with the experience of cooperation during the crisis, creating expectations of collective responsibility that transcended traditional hierarchies. Guilds and corporations developed mutual support systems that had been tested during the plague, establishing social safety nets that would persist for centuries. Concepts of community rights and responsibilities were redefined, with collective survival being recognized as a common interest that outweighed individual privileges. The sound of community assemblies became more frequent, reflecting greater democratic participation in decisions affecting public health. Popular knowledge about diseases was systematized and preserved, with recipes and practices that had shown some effectiveness being formally documented and transmitted. Although many of these practices were based on incorrect theories, some contained elements that would be validated by later science. Herbals were compiled with information about plants that had been used during the plague, creating botanical databases that would influence future pharmacology. The aroma of dried herbs being catalogued permeated libraries and monasteries where this knowledge was preserved. Attitudes towards death and mortality were profoundly transformed, with societies developing rituals and practices that reflected greater familiarity with the fragility of life. Wills became more common and detailed, reflecting an acute awareness of the need to prepare for sudden death. Cemeteries were reorganized based on sanitary principles, establishing standards that would influence funeral practices for centuries. The sound of funeral bells gained new meanings, not only marking individual passages, but reminding entire communities of the importance of valuing each day of life. The legacy of the survival strategies developed during the Black Death extended far beyond its original historical period, influencing medical development, social organization, and European culture for centuries. Although most of the specific techniques proved ineffective against the actual disease, the underlying principles of systematic observation, community cooperation, and creative adaptation laid foundations for more scientific and humane approaches to public health crises. The collective experience of facing an existential threat taught humanity valuable lessons about resilience, innovation, and the importance of maintaining hope even in the most desperate circumstances, lessons that would remain relevant for future generations facing their own crises and challenges. As we observe the survival strategies developed during the Black Death, we are confronted with a fascinating paradox of the human condition. Although the vast majority of these attempts were scientifically ineffective, they reveal something profoundly beautiful about our species: the absolute refusal to passively accept fate, even when facing forces we do not fully comprehend. Each beaked mask filled with aromatic herbs, each carefully crafted amulet, each meticulously executed purification ritual represented more than simple superstition. They were tangible manifestations of human hope, creative expressions of our determination to find meaning and control amidst absolute chaos. The sound of purifying bonfires crackling in medieval squares echoed not only attempts to cleanse the air, but also the music of human resistance against despair. The communities that reorganized during the plague, creating systems of mutual support and equitable resource distribution, demonstrated that extreme crises can reveal the best of human nature. When rigid social hierarchies proved inadequate for survival, more democratic and cooperative forms of social organization emerged. The aroma of communal soups being prepared in large cauldrons not only fed hungry bodies, but also nourished the spirit of solidarity that would allow civilization to survive and rebuild. Perhaps the most important lesson from these medieval strategies is that scientific efficacy, though crucial, is not the sole value of human responses to crises. The psychological comfort offered by rituals and amulets, the social cohesion created by cooperative efforts, and the preservation of human dignity through acts of mutual care were essential elements for maintaining sanity and humanity during the darkest years of European history. Today, as we face our own global challenges, we can find inspiration in the desperate creativity of our medieval ancestors. Although our scientific understanding is infinitely superior, our fundamental need for hope, community, and meaning remains unchanged. The distant echo of medieval bells ringing in plague-stricken cities reminds us that, even in the darkest moments, humanity finds ways to create light, music, and beauty. The Black Death ended, but its legacy of human resilience continues to inspire us, whispering through the centuries that, no matter how impossible the situation may seem, there is always something we can do. There is always a way to resist. There is always a reason to keep the flame of hope alive.